Okay, the meeting has started recording. So far, I have members Corse, Tebbets, Gray, Dementric, Farrell, Campany, Flynn, Miller, Moore, Klein, Oates, Dupany, Giroux, Miller, as in Liz Miller, Brown, Minter, and Young. Is there anyone else, any other members that I've missed that are now joining us?
Chair Duval is here.
Thank you very much. So is member Knutson on? Borneman? Tierney?
Yes.
Tierney, thank you. Curley? Coert? And Clark? No.
Okay. Well, thank you. So we do have a quorum, so we can get started. Happy New Year, everybody, and welcome. It's the January 4, 2021 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. And before we get started with the agenda, I just thought we would see if our new member, Brian Gray, is on. Brian, if you
I am.
Ah, great. Well, welcome. And thank you for agreeing to serve on the council. And I don't know if folks have had a chance to look at the bios that are updated, but love to hear a little bit about yourself before we get started.
Sure. Happy to be here. I'm Brian Gray. I've been in the energy industry for the past 30 plus years. A good share of that was with Vermont Gas Systems. I currently am with the Energy Co-op of Vermont. We are a small field dealer in Colchester. We deliver fuel oil, kerosene, wood pellets. We provide full service, including installation of heat pumps, as well as going out and doing energy audits and weatherization projects.
Oh, great. Well, thank you again for agreeing to be a part of the council and the work ahead of us, and welcome. Happy New Year. So the agenda has been posted, and make sure everybody has access to it. The agenda today is sort of a wrap up of the 3 meetings that we've done to provide basically the fundamentals. The first meeting for Brian's awareness, we spent on how to serve as a council within state government, and there are some slides and information in there that might be very helpful that relate to the public records law, the open meeting law, and the ethics commission, and we can certainly get you in touch with folks if you need some questions answered. The first meeting after that, the next meeting after that, we spent time on inventorying the state of the climate in Vermont, as well as the programs that are ongoing. And today we're going to finish up with resilience, focused on resilience, and what programs do we currently have focused on resilience. So today's agenda starts with approval of the minutes from the December 21, 2020 meeting. So I'll accept a motion to approve if one has.
So moved.
All right. Thank you, Secretary Flynn. Is there a second?
Second.
Great. Thank you. Any discussion on the minutes, which have been posted and I believe emailed to all the members? Okay, hearing no discussion, use the hand function. I don't see any hands raised, and Melissa will keep an eye out for us on that. But if your hand function doesn't work, feel free to speak and we'll see you. Okay, well then we can all in favor of approval of the minutes of December 21, 2020. Please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Anybody opposed? Okay, thank you. The minutes for December 21, 2020 are approved. So in reviewing the agenda, the next item is a few minutes on the meeting etiquette. And after that, we will be hearing from Susanna Davis, who is the State of Vermont Executive Director of Racial Equity. on the importance of equity in developing our climate action plan. We'll do an inventory of the existing programs to build resiliency, which is one of the items we are required to address by the Global Warming Solution Act. Take a short break and then move on to climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience on natural working lands, and do a brief organizational update followed by public comments. So we thought it would be helpful to cover the meeting etiquette after the last meeting. There was some question about the meeting etiquette. We do have a document which we have provided online, and we'll start to make sure there's a link to it, which is the team's etiquette for members of the public who are in attendance. And we thought we could review that, and then if there's any discussion on that or any discussion around etiquette for actually members of the council, we can have a discussion about that. So I believe someone can post the etiquette, Melissa. Oh, great. Thank you, Angela. Angela's here to help us as well. So posted on your screen should be the team's etiquette for members of the public, which I believe we reviewed at the first meeting, but is basically what we have on our website, and we'll have a link in every agenda going forward. So for members of the public, they're always welcome to attend. It is a public meeting and an open meeting. We ask that you enter the meeting on mute and stay muted during the meeting, and public comments will be at the end of the meeting only. We always accept written comments from the public, and those can be sent at the email address you see in the agenda, and you'll find that on the Vermont Climate Council document site. We ask folks to speak clearly and concisely so everyone can hear what you're saying, and we ask that no one stop recording the meeting. Council members or the public, Melissa and Andrea will be responsible as coordinators to make sure the meeting's recorded. And everyone should understand that the meeting will be posted publicly online after the meeting is held. Teams does not allow for live streaming, but it does allow for us to post a link to the meeting online, and we have been doing that from the beginning. If you're calling in by phone, it would be great if you could call in 15 minutes prior to the meeting. If you want to be on the list to comment, and we will make sure that Melissa and Andrea have your name and that you will be called on during the comment period. Otherwise, you will, be asked to raise your hand if you want to comment. Again, enter on mute, and the coordinator will call you by the last 4 digits of your phone number if there's no name, and ask you to state your name and whether you'd like to speak, and then keep track of that. So I think that for those, if you're actually signed into Teams and not entering by phone, we just ask that you use the raise hand option when it's time for comments. But if you can't do that during the public comment period, we'll ask for folks after we've gone through those who have set aside time and raised their hands to speak up if you want to be heard. And then to help others, if you keep your video off, unless you're speaking, it helps enhance the audio quality. So those are the etiquette rules that we ask that public members in attendance respect and abide by. So with that, I can open it up to discussion and for the council members, and whether there's any other items you think would be helpful for the public to participate in the and listen to the meeting meaningfully, or any other items. So Melissa, I see no hands raised. And so is there anyone who does not have the hand raising function as a member of the council who'd like to comment or address the etiquette for members of the public? Okay. In terms of meeting etiquette for members of the council, is there anybody who'd like to address that topic this morning? I think it's great to see so many faces on video this morning. It's helps me anyway to know that, you know, people are engaged, and I think it's going to be really helpful to members, you know, of the public who see these meetings later to actually see faces when we're not looking at handouts. So again, Melissa, I don't see any hands raised unless you do.
I do not.
Okay. Anybody who doesn't have the hand raise function who'd like to speak up now, please. Well, okay then, great. Thank you. We can get right into the agenda then. Susanna Davis is here with us this morning. She is the State's Director of Racial Equity. I am trying to get out of the agenda now and link to, give me a moment. Okay, great. Susanna, you're there. There you are. Good morning. Welcome. Happy New Year. Susanna is the State of Vermont Executive Director of Racial Equity. She's attached to the Agency of Administration Secretary's office, so I have the pleasure of working closely with Susanna. She joined us now over, it was what, July of last year, so she's been our Director of Racial Equity for about 6 to 18 months now. She's a very, very busy person. She's been doing great work over the last 18 months, and she is helping us bring equity into all of our policy decisions and making sure that we're thinking about the impacts of our decisions on racial equity in Vermont. And so she's here because, you know, this is a very important conversation with implications for many different groups. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Susanna. And Susanna, you have the floor.
Thank you. Buenos dias, everybody. Susanna Davis. It is Monday. It is Monday morning, first Monday of the new year. So naturally, I am so excited to depress you today because oftentimes when I am present at a meeting or a conference discussing equity, I think the expectation is, oh boy, she's going to tell us that we're awful in everything that we do. And we'll do a little of that. But we're also going to talk about some solutions and approaches and perspectives that you can take to make sure that the work you're doing is really, really moving the needle for equity and moving the needle for everybody. So I'm going to share my screen and go off video. I hope that this works. You know how technology is. I'm going to talk a little fast because I'm very bad at managing time for these things, but please do feel free to interrupt me if I have gone choppy or if I need to explain something. Where am I? Can anybody not see the slide on the screen?
My screen is black, Susanna. It's Liz Miller.
Okay, so I'm gonna have to share the other way. Evidently, there's multiple ways to share, and some of them don't work as well as others.
There, I can see that. Great.
Okay. All right. So the first thing that we have to say is we have to remind ourselves that the land that we know as Vermont remains unceded territory of Indigenous people. This is so important because we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of ownership a little bit later in the presentation. But this is something that we've got to call out. What we're doing right now, this is not a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements usually tend to be much more involved and a little bit more substantive. This is just a gentle reminder that when we talk about climate policy or anything having to do with the ecology, that we keep this in mind. I want to talk a little bit about Vermont specifically when it comes to racial disparities in various sectors. We know, for example, that nationally, 16% of Black Americans say that they don't visit national parks because they don't feel safe there. We know that in Vermont, we have more Indigenous people being diagnosed with depression than we do white people. We know that in Vermont, we also have a deep disparity in home ownership rate, whereas in 2015, for white Vermonters, that rate was 72%. It was only 48% for people of color. And we also know that in Vermont, if you are a Black American, you are more than 6 times as likely to be arrested for misdemeanor possession of marijuana than a white person is in Vermont, despite the fact that people from both racial groups have the same, roughly the same rates of use of cannabis. Now, I want to talk also about the demographics, because when we talk about climate policy or environmental policy, we're not just planning for what we have here and for who we have here, we're also planning for the future. And so this is what that future is going to look like. The median age in Vermont is the second highest in the nation. That is to say, we're the second oldest state in the nation. And we also are the second least diverse state in the nation. The #1 spots on both of those metrics go to the state of Maine. But those 2 metrics alone don't really tell the whole story. Because if you break that down by racial group, then what you'll find is that white Vermonters and Indigenous Vermonters do have median ages in the mid and late 40s respectively, but all other Vermonters of color have median ages in the 20s. And so what that tells us is that that next generation of consumers, of young adults, of home buyers, home builders, that next generation of policymakers are going to be increasingly racially diverse. And that tracks with what we know at the national level, which is that the Millennial and Gen Z cohorts are the 2 most racially diverse in the country's history. What you're now looking at is a bar graph showing something similar. It's showing the projected change in population in Vermont by racial group. So what you'll see is that by 2050, the Black population in Vermont is predicted to grow by almost 300%, the Latino population by over 170%, the Asian Pacific Islander population in Vermont is predicted to grow by about 180%. The Indigenous population is set to grow by about 20%, and the mixed race or other population by over 200%. Now, yes, you are likely thinking to yourself, okay, but there's only about 10,000 Black people in Vermont, so 300% growth is, by raw numbers, perhaps not explosive. But of course, we're talking about the rate, we're talking about the percentage, and we're talking about the possibilities that come with that. So it's slow change, but it's happening. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the sense of ownership, not just concrete ownership of the environment, but also ownership of the discussion and the dialogue around climate. What you're looking at now is a screenshot from a tweet by the president who says that he's happy to inform all of the people living their suburban lifestyle dream that they will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in their neighborhoods. Now, the concept of their neighborhoods and who is allowed to be included or excluded and why is really big. And this is one of the equity issues that we face when we talk about climate policy or environmental justice. The reason is that when we consider land and the ecology to be exclusive, when we believe that we have that power and that authority over our environment, then it leads us to believe then that policy solutions should have our best interests in mind and should be shaped by what we like and what we don't like. So this is often the cycle that we see happening. We have an ecological policy of some sort, something that we believe in, perhaps a value related to the environment, which leads to regulation. Those regulations will start to shape the neighborhood amenities or other tangible ecological factors in our neighborhoods. And those amenities, the distribution of, let's say, health promoting or health deleterious neighborhood amenities is going to create benefits and burdens for different people. Now, those benefits and burdens are going to lead to more eco policy, right? Because we're going to say, hey, you know what? Actually, this is hurting the turtles. So let's stop, or let's change the regulation, or hey, oops, it turns out that we gave all the Latinos asthma by accident. So let's change the regulations. And so we go through this cycle where we have a policy or a value, we regulate based on that. It shapes our communities, and then those benefits and burdens end up surfacing themselves. And at that point, it's our responsibility to sort of rinse and repeat and make sure that we're equitably distributing the benefits and equitably mitigating the harms. I want to talk a little bit about those benefits and burdens, because that's where we really start to see the narrative that takes place. Now, this is a clip from a news article that was printed yesterday. And I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but I'm smiling because it's hard to read this article with a straight face. It's called "A Slap in the Face: The Pandemic Disrupts Young Oil Careers." And this is a long form article in the Times yesterday about young people who are soon to be or recent grads who had high hopes for entering the oil industry, who are now deeply disappointed by the impact that COVID-19 has had on their prospects for careers in oil. And that is certainly one perspective that we can take when we look at climate policy, energy policy, et cetera. But the way that we frame these discussions is so important, because if we're centering the experiences of prospective elite oil execs, and this, I should clarify, this article doesn't focus on, for example, like oil rig workers or people who are considered at the front line of the industry. It's really more about people who were seeking to enter more executive level positions. So when we frame the discussion from the perspective of, let's say, these young prospective would-be elite executives in oil, it can sometimes be difficult to understand the breadth of the oil industry's impact on the ecology and on the people who are most likely to be affected by it, right? Which means frontline workers, people of color, and low-income people. So framing is important. And so when we think about talking about the suburban lifestyle dream, or we talk about the benefits and the burdens as they impact communities, it's really important that we recognize who is benefiting, who is experiencing a burden, and which of those experiences are we prioritizing going forward. I want to give one example of the ways in which climate policy impacts social equity, particularly racial equity. You have likely heard of food deserts. Those are areas that have few or no healthy food options. You may not have heard of food swamps. They are areas that have more unhealthy food options than healthy food options. And usually the metric is 4 unhealthy options for every healthy option. I'll give you one example. In Brooklyn, New York, there's one neighborhood. It's called East New York, and it's just 2 zip codes, but they're very small because, it's New York, it's condensed. And in those 2 zip codes, there are 31 fast food restaurants. Now, that's all considered one neighborhood. It's just one little cluster of one little borough of one little city in one state. 31 fast food restaurants and very few grocery stores. That's a food swamp. Now, we know that certain things like zoning policy, which is deeply rooted in environmental issues, impacts what kinds of businesses can flourish or can flourish in a neighborhood. We know that the presence of food deserts and food swamps tracks really closely with things like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. And we know that those are underlying conditions that, for example, have made people far more vulnerable to things like COVID-19. So where we are citing or permitting the citing of certain kinds of businesses has a direct impact on the nutritional health of the people who live in those neighborhoods. And the nutritional health of people who live in those neighborhoods is going to have a direct impact on that neighborhood's vulnerability to something like a global pandemic that has particularly strong hold on the upper respiratory system. Now, it goes beyond just the impact on heart disease, diabetes, and obesity. We also know that poor nutrition generally has broader social effects. It increased the costs for health in our society, and it also decreases productivity. The cost, for example, of diagnosed diabetes has gone up by more than a quarter over the last 5 years. It now costs us nationally over $300 billion with a B dollars. And that's just the cost of diagnosed diabetes. We all probably know someone or know someone who's known someone who has undiagnosed and unmanaged diabetes, which has much more unpredictability and higher costs than that. We also know that job absenteeism based on obesity costs more than $4 billion annually in this country, and it drives healthcare costs of over $200 billion annually. So again, when we think about things like public health, nutrition, where we cite certain kinds of businesses, and how we distribute the health promoting or health deleterious impacts of our policy, it has real concrete downstream impacts. We just have to be able and willing to look for them. I want to talk about another example that affects us very much here in Vermont, but that is rooted in historical policy. And this is important because oftentimes when we think about climate policy or ecological policy, we're thinking about what we can do going forward, or we're thinking about perhaps what are the policies that we've implemented or taken away in the last, let's say, decade or two. But so much of the situation today is dependent on things that happened long before we arrived. This, we'll say, our generations arrived. For example, we know that the New Deal brought with it a lot of positive benefits, including collective bargaining and certain labor protections. But we know that those labor protections deliberately excluded domestic workers and agricultural workers. Now, at the time, they pretended that was race neutral. But in fact, domestic work and agricultural work were almost exclusively done by Black Americans, newly emancipated, sort of, Black Americans in the US. And so they omitted those professions, not because of the professions themselves, but rather because of who comprised those professions. So as a result, we, a primarily agricultural state, rely very heavily on a labor force that to this day does not enjoy the same labor protections that the rest of us do. And that largely dates back to a very intentional, though sneaky, policy that was designed to target people of specific race. So when we think about policy going forward, it's so important that we recognize that we're not just working from a new blank slate, but rather we're carrying with us everything that was set into motion years ago. And the more that we build good policy on top of bad policy, the less stable our foundation will be unless we go back and really address the bad policy that existed in years prior. And it's a tall order, I recognize, it's a big ask, but we want to get this right. And so what that means is, sometimes you need a patch job, but sometimes you really need a whole new system. Here's a related example. Now, we know that our ag sector in this state is particularly dependent on the work of migrant Vermonters, many of whom are Latino. And I want to talk a little bit about climate and the impact that it's having on the Latino community. Many of you don't know this, but the Latino community is seen as the #1 group that is being negatively impacted by climate change, particularly in North America. More than half of Latinos and Latino Americans live in the 3 states that are experiencing the biggest climate change effects. We're talking about California, Texas, and Florida. We are more likely to work in industries that are deeply affected by climate change, which includes agriculture, construction, and manufacturing. And we know that about 80% of the farm workers in the country are Latino, and over 16% of them are natural resource laborers. So ag, forestry, fishing, hunting, and that's compared to only 10% of non-Hispanic white people. So it's definitely a larger share of Latino people who are in these industries who are experiencing the negative implications of climate change. Now, what does that mean in terms of health? Well, we know that almost half of Latinos in the United States live in counties that are often in violation of ground level ozone layers and ground level ozone levels, which has to do with air quality. It exacerbates asthma and other respiratory illnesses. This is why, for example, a Latino child of 8 years old is twice as likely to die of an asthma attack than a white child is. We also know that 165%, we are 165% more likely to live in counties that have unhealthy levels of ppm, poorer air quality generally. And we are 51% more likely to live in counties that have unhealthy ozone levels than white people are. So these are some of the negative ramifications that can affect one particular ethnic group. Of course, this is not to say that this is only impacting Latino people, but this is just one example of a way that there's a little bit less equity, racial equity, when we think about what industries and what neighborhoods are more affected. Now, I talked a little bit earlier about ownership and a sense of ownership, not just of land itself, but also of community and the topic, the dialogue, and the tools and resources for addressing the problem. And what you're looking at is a photo that I took over the summer, perhaps this spring. This is my neighbor's vehicle. I was passing by and I saw this, and you can't see the license plate, and that's on purpose, but they had a license plate from a nearby state. And this was, of course, when people in Vermont were harassing other people in Vermont for having out-of-state license plates during COVID-19. And they had to write on their back window, "We live in VT, waiting on new plates." And I took this photo. It was very powerful for me because it said a lot about the fear that people have just being here, because they are so scared that they're going to be treated like outsiders. Because in our state, we have a unique flavor of out-of-state xenophobia that makes people treat others like outsiders. And of course, the fear and the panic of COVID-19 didn't help at all. So that people feel like they have to put caveats on their vehicles because they're so afraid of harassment, vandalism, or other forms of bias says a lot about the atmosphere that we've created in our state, that people feel uncomfortable or unsafe being here. I should also mention the owners of this vehicle are white, and you probably wouldn't know they're not from Vermont because they're from a state that's culturally very similar to Vermont. But just imagine if they looked more like, I don't know, me. Now, we talked about framing, we talked about language and the messaging and people feeling like insiders and outsiders. And I want to take this a bit further because framing matters so much. Remember the young aspiring oil tycoons, how we frame an issue, who we're sympathizing with, who we're empathizing with, and who we are villainizing in ecological policy is really important, right? What you're looking at is two images, both very similar, except one features a person of color and one features two white people. And you'll see that two related publications describe them very differently. On the top, the image of a person of color wading through water after Katrina, the caption reads, a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store, blah, blah, blah. On the bottom, you see an almost identical image, and it's described as two residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store, blah, blah, blah. Now, you might think this is a one-off or just that one publication being a jerk, but I can assure you it's not, because here's another one. Same natural disaster. Here's another image, two people of color, and they are described as, quote, looters carrying bags of groceries. And here's another one, and it may be cut off at the bottom. I'll read the caption for you. It's an image showing two white people, and they are described as people salvaging supplies from a destroyed business. So the way that we frame things is so important. And I show these images often, and oftentimes people chuckle at it because it really is quite ridiculous. But truth be told, it's really not a laughing matter, because what's the difference between a finder or a survivor and a looter? A shotgun in your face. So the way that we frame these issues is so important. The language that we use. Are we talking about equity in using language of things like charity? Are we giving people opportunities or giving you a park versus a waste treatment facility? Or are we, righting a historical wrong? Speaking of a shotgun in your face and the concept of looting, we're still on the topic of sense of ownership generally, and I wanted to point this out. I know this may not seem like it's on topic, but it is, I promise. You might remember over the summer that there were a lot of protests around racial equity, and despite the fact that all of this conversation was happening much more intensely than usual, we still had the government murdering brown people around the country. One such person was Jacob Blake, who was murdered by the police in Washington. That's the person who's pictured on the left. And on the right is a young man who, during the protests following Jacob Blake's murder, he, a 17-year-old person, took a semi-automatic weapon, drove 20 minutes across state lines to a state in which he does not reside to go and, quote, defend the property against the, quote, looters who were protesting the murder of the unarmed civilian on the left. So framing, right? Sense of ownership. On the left, you have a person who was murdered by the government, and this headline says he had a knife in the car when the police shot him 7 times in the back, as if that was relevant. And on the right, we have the person who shot 2 people because he was defending property in another state, property he doesn't own. And they tell us, this is the same publication, they feel that it's necessary to point out that he was spotted cleaning graffiti before the shooting. And that's not the shooting, it's before he shot 2 people across state lines in the middle of the night as a 17-year-old with a semi-automatic weapon to defend property he doesn't own, right? So when we think about the sense of ownership, it's not just about ownership of land or property that isn't yours. It's also about the sense of ownership over order and over policy and over dialogue, right? That you have a group of people protesting something that happened outside your community, outside your state, and you feel that it's incumbent upon you to go and defend a 7-Eleven over there. Says a lot about your role in the conversation. I'm going to touch on this really quickly. On the left, there's a photo of a woman who was sentenced to 5 years in prison because she was homeless and needed an address for her son to be enrolled in school. So she used her friend's address, and they incarcerated her for 5 years because she used someone else's address because she was homeless. And then, of course, on the right, you may have heard recently that this subject was just released early from her 2-month sentence after paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to bribe top colleges to let her children in. Right? So when we think about the sense of ownership and privilege, these are all disparities that make themselves very, very visible. We just have to be willing to acknowledge them and then do something about it. So that brings us to, how do we do policy in a way that is equitable? And one of the most important things that we need to do is to ask ourselves certain questions along the way during the process. For example, ask yourself, are you putting forward a proposal that promotes equity in service delivery? Is it enhancing services to underrepresented communities? What are we doing to move the needle? Are we involving the community in designing our proposals, or are we coming up with something and then presenting it to them as their options, as determined by us? Which communities were involved? How were they involved? Did we only put a message on Facebook and expect people to come to us? Or did we do affirmative outreach? Did we do it in multiple languages? Did we do it by offering comment periods that are outside of business hours because people have day jobs? Did we do a multi-sectoral approach? Are we incorporating more than just our own sectors? Are we building a real coalition with people and sectors that are impacted here? Are we engaging in harm reduction? For example, if we're proposing a budget cut, who's going to suffer from that cut, and what are we going to do to keep those folks whole? Is our work data informed? And if not, why not? Is it that we just don't have the information? Again, if not, why not? And how can we use this as an opportunity to collect those data? And finally, what metrics, what timelines are we putting into place to make sure that we stick to our own goals? So these are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves as we come up with policies and proposals that are designed to benefit the ecology and Vermont as a whole. Some of you will recognize these questions or these general topics as things that are present in the EIA, that's the Equity Impact Assessment tool that we recently rolled out. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the state now uses what effectively is a questionnaire to make sure that any budget or policy asks are going through a filter of questions like these, so that we can identify any potential unforeseen circumstances that would negatively impact different demographic groups, and so that we can mitigate any harm. So just as an example, if we were to put forward a policy that has a negative impact on the spiritual practices of the Abenaki community, asking ourselves these kinds of questions would help us to discover that and would help us to avoid the resultant racial disparity. And I'm actually using a real example, that is the Tobacco 21 legislation, which makes it more difficult for people under 21 who are Abenaki in Vermont to be able to practice certain sacred rituals related to or using tobacco, because it is considered a sacred plant. So having a religious carve out for that would have looked something like the religious carve out for Catholic minors who take church wine, for example. I want to talk just really briefly about false solutions. Sometimes we will find ourselves discussing certain solutions and saying, well, this is the way to make positive change with the ecology. But it's not actually serving people. It's just what we're willing to do. It's how far we're willing to go, but not necessarily what's actually needed. And one example that comes to mind, and this isn't a personal critique of the policy, but I'm using it as an example, things like carbon trading. The idea behind carbon trading is that it's politically safe and economically safe as a way of compromise in some effort to reduce carbon emissions. But carbon trading doesn't really actually do anything for us on the ground per se. It's not going to help those Latinos who are 165% more likely to live in an area with poor air quality. It's not going to help those 8-year-old Latino children who are twice as likely to die of an asthma attack, really. But what it does is it implies that the laws of nature will remain subordinate to the laws of capitalism by allowing us to do funny stuff with the numbers, to trade credits as if the Arctic shelf cares about our credits, right? So when we think about solutions, we've got to remember that there are solutions that actually have substantive impact on the subject matter versus the solutions that are just there because that's what we're willing to compromise on. And you've got to ask yourself, is that helping the people on the ground, people who are at the front lines? I'm going to end, and I usually end with this quote, but today I've got two for you because this is important. The first is this one from Curtis Ogden. He's over at the Interaction Institute, and he says that the work for racial equity, it's about undoing as much as it is about doing. We don't simply build new culture or behavior on top of old, especially in situations that are characterized by oppression. Some things must be released, and this letting go does not come easy. And you'll remember that we talked about something similar earlier when we talked about, for example, the New Deal, which is because of the specific racially targeted aspects of it, bad policy that we've just continued to build on, which has created racial disparity in today's ag sector, for example. So undoing is so important, not just creating new good policy, but making sure that what we have in place right now isn't taken as a given if it doesn't have to be. The second quote I'd like to leave you with, this is over from Bill McKibben in a good series that Yes Solutions did about ecological justice. And he says, the economic rearrangement that must accompany any successful effort to fix the planet's climate system is an opportunity to make sure that the people who've always been left out won't be put at the back of the all-electric bus. So that's what I got for you. I'm going to stop the share and thank you all for your time.
Susanna, we have some time for questions or comments or reactions or discussion. So if you're available to stay with us for about 15 minutes, that would be
absolutely
really great. Again, Susanna, it's always great to have a discussion with, and I welcome anybody who wants to start.
Member Dupany Giroux has her hand raised, please.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Susanna. I just wanted to express my deep gratitude for everything that you just shared, for bringing your positionality, your intersectionality to a very delicate and sensitive issue, and putting it into a context that is so positive in terms of things to consider to move forward. And I just wanted to just express my deepest gratitude. So thank you.
Thank you, Leanne.
Member Moore, please.
Good morning, Susanna. I wanted to ask a question that I am wrestling with myself, which is about the schedule for the work of the Climate Council and our ability to sort of meaningfully have the very types of conversations you flagged. And if you have sort of thoughts and suggestions for how best to approach, knowing that we need to be able to deliver at least the initial climate action plan by December 1st of this year. And that means having a draft ready probably 2 months prior to that, so that the complete plan is something that can be shared broadly with the public and provide time for them to review and provide comment. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on what you see as key steps in engaging communities that maybe traditionally haven't been as well served by government public participation processes in thinking about how we plan our work for the next 9 months.
Yeah, I have a few suggestions on that. Some of them are easy ones, right? Making sure that if you're giving folks the ability to join a session for comment, that you do so, you give opportunities outside of business hours so that people who have day jobs can still participate. It means making sure that we're engaging in multiple languages. Vermont has a number of languages spoken here, and so translating materials is important, or giving people the opportunity to provide feedback in a way that is accessible to them is really important. Another thing that can be done is to, how do you say this? Well, I'm actually going to skip that one and go to the big one, which is, it's going to feel very, well, I'm going to say it, and you're going to say that's not an option, but reconsider. Change the deadline. And I know what you're thinking, oh, this might require a long legislative process, or hey, but we set a date and this is what we wanted. And here's the thing though, if we're really wanting to do something right and do it equitably, then we don't have to remain beholden to a time frame that we ourselves made up and that we ourselves can change. So I do urge you to consider if slowing down the process to perfect it will lead to equitable policy, then do that, because that's more important, I think, than the times that we set for ourselves. That's the most polite way that I can put it, because other folks will phrase it as follows. Other folks will phrase it as, deadlines are a tool of white supremacy. I don't usually refer to deadlines as tools of white supremacy, but deadlines often do reinforce a white supremacy culture that prizes itself more on process than equitable outcome. So that's my big suggestion. But otherwise, yes, things like language access, things like non-business hour participation, and then also bundle it with a service, right? Sometimes we go to communities and we ask them for information or for data or for comment, and it's really kind of a data extraction as opposed to a data exchange, where we say, hey, we're asking you to participate in this for us, and we come bearing gifts for you. So maybe at the community center, we're sending a rep from, I don't know, tax and A&R and labor. And if you have questions about any of those other things, we're sending you people who can answer those questions for you. Or like, hey, here's a bucket load of PPE or something. Thank you for your time, you know? So making it an exchange and making sure that communities recognize that you're not just going to come in and extract good quotables and leave again.
Thank you.
Member Minter, please.
Hi, Susanna. Thank you so much. This was very insightful and revealing, and I greatly appreciate the presentation. And I just wanted to ask you or ask you to help us think about another layer of disparity and inequality, and that's economic inequality. And, I represent the anti-poverty work of the community action agencies and think a lot about, these two issues that we often, I think, commingle, and they need to be thought about both together and apart. And I've been thinking an awful lot, Julie, thank you for raising the issue of engagement. And I would like to recommend that we have a discussion about this at some point in the near future, maybe a subgroup. I've certainly been giving a lot of thought around how we can use our network and community action to immediately begin the process of education and engagement, because we cannot wait until we have, to your point, ideas to present. We actually need to begin right now helping to educate folks about this process and think with them about structures of engagement. So I just wondered, one thought is, while you at the beginning of your presentation looked at race, I wonder if you could look at poverty and the growth of poverty, including during an incredible preceding COVID economic expansion. It's very important that we see that as well. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. You're 100% right. And I'm so glad that you said that. It's interesting. In the United States, we often use poverty as a proxy for race when we're doing, work or in a number of topics. But in Vermont, just because of our demographic makeup, you actually can't, because by raw numbers, you have more white people living in poverty in the state, and more people of color live in the state's wealthiest county than in other parts of the state. But again, that's the trick of numbers, right? And that's why people like me are not mathematicians, because when you look at it more closely, you'll find that despite the fact that in raw numbers you have fewer people of color living in poverty in Vermont, the rate is still significantly higher, right? So in other words, as a percentage of the total population of people of color, there's still a higher poverty rate than there is among the white population. Another thing is that yes, it's absolutely a matter for people living in poverty or people experiencing socioeconomic disparity. And for many other groups, the LGBTQIA+ community, people living with disabilities, you name it, there's the intersectionality that has to be looked at. So I completely agree. And the other thing that I'll say about that is, again, we talk about things like ownership. It's often the case that people who rent and people who don't have transportation and people who don't own land feel like they can't be part of this conversation because they don't feel like they have a tangible stake in it. And so that engagement really has to be ramped up for these communities because it does affect everybody. It is everybody's job. And when we allow people who own land or property to dominate the conversation about land in our state, then we're doing a disservice to everyone.
Thank you. There were a few comments in the chat from members that I just want to read for the record. We've got member Clark that said, "I'd just like to thank you for sharing. My mom is Latino and our family is close to the Latino community of Vermont. I really appreciate you bringing these realities to the table. It's all extremely important. Muchas gracias." Member Campany said, "Regarding the deadline and getting the work right, thank you." Member Clark also agrees with Sue, and Member Klein agreed, Sue, and being creative about outreach. Using the usual channels may exclude people from, people whose voices must need to be heard. And looks like Chair Young has her hand raised.
Actually, I see that Abby raised hers, so I'm happy to wait.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you, Susanna, so much for your presentation and the thought that you've put into all of these issues and bringing them forward to us. I wondered if perhaps we could consider engaging in an initial process around this regarding the council itself and the subcommittees. I think this is going to come up a lot, particularly when we're thinking about who we bring into the subcommittees and how we ensure that the voices that need to be heard within those subcommittees are compensated for being there appropriately and equitably. I struggle with issues like this myself, as I talked about the last meeting. You know, as a lay person trying to do this work, there is no compensation for this work. This is not work that I am paid to do, but it is very important, and I feel a voice like mine is deeply important to be here to do this work. And I think that I represent only one tiny portion of the voices that need to be heard and are not here. And so I really hope that we can, again, in regards to the deadline, I support that line of thought. And also in regards to the way that we think about compensating the people who do this work on the subcommittees particularly, I think if we need to revisit that legislatively, then we need to, because it's deeply inequitable how we ensure who comes to the table. Thank you.
So I'll jump in here now and thank you, Susanna, and remind everybody, to your point, Abby, we do have subcommittees that we're going to get up and running in the next few weeks. We'll be talking about those, I think, pretty deeply at the next meeting with a facilitator on board. And one of them is the Just Transition Subcommittee, which is supposed to focus on ensuring the strategies that we adopt to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and build resilience support all residents of the state fairly and equitably, and ensuring that the strategies consider disproportionate impacts of climate change on rural, low income and marginalized communities. So, you know, we do have a directive from the legislature to really think about this work and do it well. One note I had made to myself, and Susanna, you brought it up, and maybe I'll ask this question in the last few minutes. The note I made to myself early on in this is, should we be looking at our current strategies with respect to impacts while we're working on proposed strategies going forward? And Susanna, you said we should not build new policy on top of bad policy, which I think they're the same way of saying the same thing. So any thoughts on what we should be doing while we're looking at new proposals and strategies with respect to where we are now and the inventories that we've been trying to pull together for the council?
Absolutely. I think perhaps the biggest thing that I would say in response to that is to think creatively across the board at root causes or existing policy that may appear to be in an unrelated sector, but may actually be very impactful here. You know, again, we're talking about, like, just as an example, you know, we talk about the cost of undiagnosed diabetes or something like that, and the impact that it has on the job market. But if we can trace that back to poor nutrition, then we might end up looking at policies like breakfast in schools, which, by the way, is only a thing in America because of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, or things like food deserts and food swamps, and that will lead us to a conversation about zoning regulations, and that might lead us to a conversation about minimum lot size. I mean, it can take you places that you wouldn't have imagined. So I would just say, if you just do a lot of root cause analysis, and I think it'll end up taking you in directions that you may not have thought to look, but we should be looking. And I'm happy to sort of brainstorm some of those critical directions and share them with the council as well.
Great, thank you very much. We've got a couple minutes left. If there are anyone else on the council who has a reaction, question, or comment on this topic.
Apologies, but I don't have the hand raise function. So do you mind if I?
Oh, not at all. We want you to do that. Okay. Please, if you don't have the hand, we want you to be. And also, if you speak and you have, we will see your video, or we will see your initials if you don't have the video going. So we watch out for that as well if you don't have the hand raise function. So thank you, Johanna. Go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Susanna, for your great work and really important presentation and context. Just I mean, there's a lot to build off of what you recommended. I, would say I too struggle with the sort of tension of the timeline and how that interfaces with our work. So thinking about that, but building off of the last thing we were just talking about, from your view and the work that you do, are there big arenas you think we should start to dive that sort of, you talked about, I think, the public health connection. Are there other places you think there are big opportunities to focus on that intersectionality of so much of this stuff? I really would welcome your input on that.
Yeah, a lot of this work. I mean, one of the easiest ways to figure that out is to look at who has spent the most money on this topic at the national level. Like who fights the hardest, who brings in the most lobbyists, and that's probably the sector that you want to look at. So, there may be certain labor industries that have a vested interest in either advancing positive climate policy or in stymieing that policy. Or you may have certain groups. I see this is where we get tripped up, right? I'm going to give an example that's unrelated, but it exemplifies this process. When I was in New York, I was at the municipal legislative body, and they were trying to ban circus animals or circuses that use animals in their shows because it was an animal rights issue. And we had a lot of lobbying from regional Black-owned circus saying this would be bad. And they wanted our Black, Latino, and Asian caucus to oppose the animal rights bill because they claimed that it would hurt minority-owned businesses. And so that puts you in a really difficult spot because we're talking about an equity issue. But the substantive work, is it that it's bad policy that we're trying to enact, or that it's good policy that would have a bad impact disproportionately on an underrepresented community? And so that's one of the tricky situations that you're going to end up being put in, is to ask yourself, what's more important, the work or the impact? And so you're going to hear, I suppose, from everything from energy sector to certain labor pools. You may hear from the ag sector about this, and you're going to be confronted with that difficult decision. I think at the end of the day, if you arrive at a conclusion that is equitable, that you arrived at for the correct reasons and not just because it's the only thing that the other side will compromise on, and it's well reasoned and you've thought out who's going to benefit and who's going to be harmed, then you're well positioned. It didn't really directly answer your question. I would like to think more about it and then follow up with the council with a better answer.
Okay, well, thank you again, Susanna. We are going to move on to the next agenda item, but we'll really be looking to you, I think, often, and appreciate your offer to stick with us through this and help us do this work from an equity perspective.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Next on our agenda is a presentation on the inventory of existing programs to build resilience. We have Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife, Lewis Porter, and Conservation Planner in the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Jens Hilke. And I will turn the floor over to them and ask them to briefly introduce themselves and present us with their presentation.
Good morning. Thank you for having us, and thank you for the opportunity to do this presentation by Fish and Wildlife. Jens is going to do the presentation itself, and afterwards, happy to have questions directed either to us or to the other folks who work in this area in state government, several of whom are on this call. If there are questions we can't answer, we're happy to circle back and get answers for you as well. Jens is a member of my department in Fish and Wildlife. He works with towns, municipalities, other partnerships, other parts of state government and federal government in really trying to plan and help communities and other organizations and groups of people plan for their conservation future in the way that they want to and in the way that suits them. And so he seemed uniquely well suited to deliver this presentation to this group on the work of state government on climate change resilience. But I should say that the thing that really makes Jens well suited to this presentation is his work with other parts of state government, because this is a topic and an area that is engaged in by many departments around our state government, especially Agency of Commerce and Community Development, Vermont Transportation Agency, Emergency Management, DEC, and Forest, Parks and Recreation in our Agency of Natural Resources, and many others, and many in town and local planning and agencies and government. So it's really Jens's ability to be knowledgeable about all of that work and bring all of that together rather than a fish and wildlife focus that made him well suited to this. So I'll turn it over to Jens to briefly introduce himself and then present the material we have, current efforts towards preparing for the effects of climate change, which we know are already arriving, and where we need to strengthen those efforts and improve those efforts. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jens. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Commissioner. I'm just going to see the screen share. All right, great. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. My name is Jens Hilke. I'm a conservation planner with the department, and I want to talk about climate resilience efforts across Vermont state government. I'm going to break up the slideshow this morning into several different sections, one on planning, all sorts of different planning, another on design, conservation design, one on land protection and restoration, and another focusing on the built infrastructure. Before we get started, I just would like to make sure we're on the same page with respect to some basic terminology. Resilience, the capacity of individuals, communities, and natural and built systems to withstand and recover from climatic events, trends, and disruptions. And then adaptation refers to the adjustments in ecological, social, or economic systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli and their effects or impacts. So I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page with those basic terms. Another important piece here before we get too far into this is this piece, that even if we stop carbon output tomorrow, we're still going to be dealing with the effects of climate change. So there's a lot of focus on the carbon mitigation side of climate change, and that's absolutely appropriate. But let's not forget about just how important this resilience side of things is. The chart you see at right is from the Maine State Climate Plan and shows the effects to Maine's GDP under different climate scenarios in terms of whether they meet the Paris Agreement in yellow or not met in blue. So there are dramatic effects to the GDP in Maine, no matter what happens with respect to the amount of carbon. The other piece here is I'd like to just engage in a little myth busting. State government is doing a lot to build Vermont's resilience. To prepare for this presentation, we put together a list of 57 programs across the Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Emergency Management, Agency of Commerce and Community Development, Agency of Transportation that we're engaged in to address climate. Within this list are some of the most important tools we've got, and we need to vastly scale up the extent to which we support them. So yes, we need to increase our support for these programs. Of course, we also need to develop new strategies and programs to help the state prepare for the anticipated effects of climate change. So what's the right mix? Well, yes, we'll need to develop some new strategies, but overwhelmingly, we can scale up our efforts on existing tools. So the first piece here is planning, and we do a lot of different types of planning at a lot of different scales in state government. Here are a few sort of big picture categories for the types of planning we're engaged in. And I want to start with this 2018 State Hazard Mitigation Plan. because it's a really great document and it includes a comprehensive list of tools. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But for now, I just want to underscore that there are other types of planning and there's no shortage of great ideas. So we have a forest action plan, we have a comprehensive energy plan, we have a forest resilience plan report, we have regional plans, we also have tactical basin plans. But not all of us in state government are aware of each other's plans. And very few of us feel directly responsible for implementing them or which plan should take precedence at what time. And the resources aren't put in place to scale up the tools that we know are working. So we need additional capacity to adequately engage in this coordinated response. Breaking down silos requires capacity to engage with others. Many of us in state government are already short-staffed. We're struggling to manage our existing work, and we don't have the time to work outside the box or silo without clear direction. It's not a lack of creativity on the part of state officials to think in terms of the programs and divisions, the silos within the state government, because that's exactly how implementation happens in all of our work. And that's how we make things happen every day on all sorts of fronts. So the problem here is that we're confronted with a challenge, climate change, that cuts across all these various silos. So it's a lack of resources and a lack of coordination that's the problem, not a lack of planning. I mentioned earlier that the 2018 Vermont State Hazard Mitigation Plan presents the hazard impacts most likely to affect Vermont and a mitigation strategy to reduce or eliminate our most significant vulnerabilities. This is a complete rewrite of the 2013 plan, both in the content of the plan document and its mitigation actions. Vermont Emergency Management, along with the key stakeholders, completed a thorough review of the 2013 State Hazard Mitigation Plan at the beginning of the update process, and they wanted to ensure that nothing in the previous versions would be lost in this rewrite. Now, Vermont Emergency Management has a grant program to encourage local hazard mitigation plans. A FEMA-approved local hazard mitigation plan is required for local governments that wish to receive federal funds from the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program. That local plan is also one of the mitigation actions needed to qualify for additional post-disaster funding through the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, ERAF, that I'll mention again later. So at this local level, about 175 of the 281 or so, about 62% of the towns in Vermont already have local hazard mitigation plans. Those local plans have to be in conformance with the state plan, but that's kept kind of general. Basically, they have to at least consider the hazards that are addressed in the state plan. Now, again, this is excellent work, but for implementation to happen, the parts of for implementation, parts of it need to be delegated to the various agencies. All staff need to feel that they are responsible for implementing it, and they have to have clarity on what specifically their piece is. Excuse me. Okay, so why is land use planning a resilience issue? Again, that definition, the capacity of natural and built systems to withstand and recover from climatic events. So we shouldn't put homes and businesses in places that we know are going to be affected by climate change. And often that means we're talking about flooding. Where flooding happens is not that difficult to predict. Okay, so to address this land use system, we have some statewide planning. We have 14 statewide planning and development goals that call out a land use pattern of compact settlement surrounded by rural countryside. We talk about goals like promoting compact settlement surrounded by rural countryside, providing a strong economy that maintains high environmental standards, identifying, protecting, and preserving important natural and historic features, maintaining and improving the quality of air, water, wildlife, and land resources, strengthening agricultural and forest industries. So that's that state planning goals, okay? Then we have the regional plans. We have 11 regional plans and regional planning commissions to help enable these goals. Then we have 273 municipalities or municipal entities that each do separate town planning. Now, about 78%, about 84% of the municipalities in Vermont actually have a plan. About 78% of the municipalities regulate land use, but the substance of that regulation varies dramatically. So we have the state planning goals, we have these regional plans and the RPCs that are the go-between, and then we have these municipal plans. So again, planning determines what we want where. If we want large tracts of forest land to sequester carbon, that is not going to happen by accident. Our towns are underfunded. They lack capacity. I'm not just talking about money. Our rural towns are planned by volunteers. Until recently, this system is usually supported by mostly white, older adults in night meetings that are very sparsely attended. That's how this whole system of land use planning operates. So where's the next wave of volunteerism that's going to prop up this system after the baby boomers stop volunteering? We're expecting an incredibly high level of professionalism from these local plans, and yet this is really neighbors making decisions about neighbors within very specific geographies, very small jurisdictions. Okay, as a bit of an aside, in the last 8 months, we've been conducting municipal business in one of the most extraordinary times ever. The pandemic has resulted in abrupt adoption of web meeting technology that opens the door opens opportunity for involvement that was previously unknown. My point here is that some of the changes we've made in response to the pandemic, such as changes to the open meeting law that allow for these web meetings, are in fact the changes we need to make for climate resilience. So in our drive to get back to the way things were pre-pandemic, let's just be mindful that some of the changes that we've made very quickly in these last 8 months have actually been for the better and need to be maintained into the future. All right, so I'm on the topic of this, of the local land use planning system. And the town plan are required to be updated every 8 years. Well, every 10 years, the Department of Fish and Wildlife engages with partners to do a systematic review of town plans, bylaws, and subdivision with respect to wildlife and forest. We already have a consistent set of metrics that we apply for this comparison. So the 2020 version that we're working on now, we're going to begin to see the effects of recent changes associated with Act 171, the Forest Integrity Bill that includes some land use planning provisions requiring towns to plan for forest blocks and habitat connectors. So in some instances, this review of town plan shows us what's not yet on towns' radars. So for example, in 2010, only 2% of Vermont towns mentioned the words climate change. We expect that to be vastly different this go around. But most importantly, this review confirms that there's a huge rift between the good planning we're doing, all that aspirational language in the town plans, and the actual regulatory protection of areas deemed important. So we have about 94% of plans identify at least one regulatory policy for the conservation of wildlife habitat. So they identify regulatory policies, and yet only half of, so 82% have zoning, and about half of the municipalities have subdivision regulations. And subdivision really appears to be the best, a better way to reflect key conservation concepts than some of the other tools. So let me just show you what this change in pattern at the local level has looked like. So this is an aerial photo from the Stowe-Waterbury town line at If you follow my cursor, you see that's Route 100. That's the turn for Moscow Road. And this is an aerial photo from 1962. What I've done here is I've colored forest cover. And you can see that in 62, this forest is connected to a larger network of other forests. This chunk of forest is part of something much bigger. Here's 1974, here's 1980, 96, 2007, 2011. Now, from a wildlife perspective, this forest block is no longer connected north to south. You'll see that there are some trees here, but those are not colored green. They're less than 20 acres. They're completely surrounded by roads and development. So this area has become very fragmented, and this forest block is no longer connected north to south. It remains to be seen whether this area is connected east to west. This happens to be called the Schuettsville Hill Wildlife Road Crossing, one of the most important wildlife road crossings in Vermont. But interestingly, the total amount of green on the slide between 1962 and 2011 hasn't changed. Some forest regrew in this area that you might not have noticed. So if we look at the parcel boundaries of the same ownership, of the same area, you can see the actual ownership. And you can see that the trend of parcelization, taking larger parcels that are owned by an individual and breaking them up into smaller and smaller parcels, has gone hand in hand with this forest fragmentation. Now, with so many small lots, you can see all those red lines. With so many small lots, you can't run a successful log job on 2 acres in a residential forest and make any money. You're going to lower the recreational opportunities for this forest by having so many ownerships. And so in many of the rural towns, the economics of keeping land intact reach this tipping point as parcelization increases. So we need a land use pattern that meets multiple objectives, like sequestering carbon, having a working landscape, having wildlife habitat, that meet multiple objectives at the same place at the same time. This type of residential development, sprawling residential development, ex-urban sprawl, that only meets one goal. We can do better. So in response to this, in response to a changing climate, entire populations of wildlife are adjusting their ranges, approximately 11 miles per decade, or about a mile per year north and south away from the equator. Let me show you the pattern that we need to maintain for these species to adapt in the face of that massive change. What we need for wildlife movement, as well as the movement of plants and ecological processes, is a system more like this. We want to allow for gene flow to keep wildlife populations healthy. They need to be able to move to adjust their ranges. The way we do that is by having large core forests, where again, we can meet multiple goals. We can have that carbon sequestration, that working forest, that wildlife habitat, that recreational opportunity. Then we're going to have smaller stepping stone forests that may not meet as many goals because of their size, but are nonetheless important because of the stepping stone function. Wildlife or plants, ecological function, can't move from this block to that block without using this stepping stone in the middle. And then we have these micro connectors, wildlife road crossings, where there are actual trees on both sides of the road connecting these blocks. And of course, the surface water and riparian network is absolutely critical for connecting the landscape. You're going to hear me say that 2 or 3 times this morning. So again, we're not going to get this pattern by accident. And we're not going to maintain this pattern if we leave it up to folks who are planning the landscape in town-sized chunks. This is a larger pattern that we need across the landscape. And so we need to think of it in that larger ecological context. So part of avoiding sprawl where we don't want it is concentrating growth where we do want it. The Vermont's compact development pattern, it matters. It underpins our Vermont brand, our economy, and our quality of life. The Agency of Commerce and Community Development has a variety of programs to help focus growth where we want it, and the towns need to invest in infrastructure where they want this development. So one example, we have a state designation program. We designate downtowns, village centers, new town centers, growth centers, and neighborhood development areas. These programs work together to provide incentives, to align policies, and give communities the technical assistance they need to encourage new development and redevelopment in our compact designated areas. We have grant programs to invest in planning. The Better Connections program seeks to increase transportation options, build resilience, and strengthen economic vitality in Vermont's community centers and neighborhoods. The program funds physical master plans that focus on a long list of things, from improving multimodal connectivity, active transportation in complete streets, access management, traffic calming, parking, wayfinding, rehabilitation of buildings, and so on. We also have a program, the Municipal Planning Grants Program supports local planning. It's funded by the property transfer tax. Currently, it's receiving about 1/4 of its statutory allocation. The regional planning commissions are one of the premier deliverers of technical assistance, and yet they are underfunded for the incredible coordination and planning work they do across the state on all sorts of fronts. One of the ways that we get money to the RPCs in state government, the Agency of Transportation pays for transportation planners in each of the regional planning commissions to take those statewide planning goals related to transportation and bring them to the local plans. So that's a great model for how other climate resilience efforts could be applied in our land use planning system. We could get a natural resource planner in every regional planning commission to help this transition from these statewide resilience goals to local implementation. So again, we have 269, 273, somewhere in there, separate municipal governments that have authority to regulate land use and development within their boundaries. 257 of those have adopted a town plan. And yet many of our rural towns are totally under-resourced to confront the challenges of climate change. The range of responsibility that we're putting at the local level is astounding. Remember, these are volunteers and they need help from professional planners and resource professionals. The future of the Vermont landscape can largely be found in municipal future land use maps and zoning maps for each town. And I have a couple examples from Newfane at left. And yet no one has stitched together all those separate zoning districts to see what the actual sum of the plans would look like. Because the definitions of a rural residential district in one town are not at all the same as what a definition might be in another town, just as one example. What does the sum of all these plans look like? We don't know. There's a lack of coordination in this local system. There are a variety of programs in state government that focus on technical assistance and natural resource topics that are focused a bit more outside the built environment. The Community Wildlife Program that I coordinate for Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department offers conservation planning technical assistance at the municipal level. Each year we reach about 1/3 of Vermont towns and we work in depth with about a 1/5 of the Vermont towns each year. In the Forest Parks and in the Department of Forest Parks and Rec, county foresters and the Urban Community Forestry Program are doing great work. In the Watershed Management Division and Department of Environmental Conservation, they've been doing great work. We're doing this technical assistance at different scales. We're working with regional planning commissions and regional planning commission staff. We're working with towns, all 273 separate municipal entities. And we're working with Vermont landowners. So there's a huge range of scales that we're engaged in this technical assistance, and all of it is under-resourced. Now, there's an operations component of resilience and in the planning for those operations. The state has an effective emergency management system with a state emergency operations center. Emergency management implements the recover component of that resilience definition that I talked about. And the state does a pretty good job in this area. There are lots of really good success stories here. This is a very good example of the multi-agency coordination and the regional planning commissions, of course, are engaged in this system. So since Hurricane Irene, the Agency of Transportation has done a lot of work on its incident management system and continuity of operations, just as one example. Now, I want to think about our towns and our communities in a more complex way because each of our towns is unique. I often show this graph when I'm working with municipalities because our towns aren't just the sum of our built capital. That's part of the community, the infrastructure, the buildings, the equipment, the gray infrastructure that we've got. It's certainly part of our capital and needs to be part of our resilience efforts. But another aspect of our communities are the human and social capital, the skills, the health, the abilities, the education of our people matters a great deal to resilience. The extent to which we have connected communities that work effectively with their government and neighbors can work effectively with each other is hugely important. Our communities also include these aspects of natural capital, and some of those are resources that we can reuse if we manage them well, or ecosystem services that we can get, again, as long as we manage it well, and then some of the intangibles. Now, I show this because response to climate change looks different in different communities depending on what their mix of capital is. The way a well-funded town might handle a problem might focus more on built capital, and the way a less wealthy town might handle that same problem might focus more on human and social capital. Overall, I just want to say that part of resilience is people, and the resilience of our people matters. So as we think about what these state resources are for resilience, what the town's resources are, we need to think about all of these different types of capital and building resilience into each of them. So again, human capital is a critical piece of resilience. And in state government, we're doing a lot of different type of training to build that resilience into our staff and our understanding. The Rivers and Roads program developed by the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Agency of Transportation with help from the Fish and Wildlife Department is an excellent example of the incredible culture change that's happened since Hurricane Irene through a dedicated training program. Fish and Wildlife Department has been working on the Highways and Habitats training for 15 years now with the Agency of Transportation. We have a Flood Ready Vermont website, the Flood Training Vermont website. Forest Parks and Rec has been doing adaptive silviculture assistance on private lands. So we're spending a lot of effort in training our people. Okay, so remember that what we put where on the landscape is hugely important for resilience. And if we're careful, we can maximize ecosystem services like carbon sequestration and improve water quality and minimize flooding. In short, we can meet multiple goals at the same place at the same time. The Fish and Wildlife Department and the Agency of Natural Resources created Vermont Conservation Design. That's a publicly accessible website and map, and it's a strategy to protect and enhance ecological function into the future. Now, there's a lot of green on the map that I'm showing at left. And what it means to be in that highest priority area is different than you might think. We can accommodate all sorts of land uses in that dark green, depending on the exact location. But those dark green areas are the lands and waters that we need to manage with ecological function in mind if we want to maintain this resilient future. So Vermont Conservation Design is a tool that identifies features at the landscape and natural community scales that are necessary for maintaining an ecologically functional landscape. That's a landscape that conserves current biological diversity and allows species to move and shift in response to climate and land use changes. So at all scales, Vermont conservation design identifies locations of ecological priority, and these are divided into highest priority and priority. And the tool allows users to make informed decisions about the locations most suitable for development and those on which to focus conservation efforts. Let me just break this up into its pieces. The map that I just showed you with all that dark green represents all of the priorities added together. Okay, that's the complete network that we need. And we can't really take that apart without losing things. But we can look at the components of what went into that overall prioritization and explain how these fit in. Now, this purple area are called interior forests. That's one component of Vermont conservation design. From a wildlife perspective, those are most easily summed up as the deep, dark woods. That's where we're going to have the most biological diversity, lots of carbon storage, water filtration. Those are our largest forest blocks. Okay, then we have this orange, the connectivity blocks. And those are the forests in Vermont that make a connected pattern, north to south, east to west. And those are the places that are important for plant and animal movement. I'm not just talking about allowing the deer to cross the road here. Again, I'm talking about genetic connectivity, allowing for entire populations to move between the Adirondacks, the greens and the whites, the Suttons to the north, the Berkshires and the Scots to the south. Then another component is the surface water and riparian area network. And again, these places are absolutely critical for biological diversity, animal movement, and a huge array of functions and values. The last piece here is physical landscape diversity. Now, this is a tough one to wrap your head around, but it is important. So today, we have biological diversity in places that are diverse in the physical landscape. They have unique mixes of slope, topography, geology, aspect. And while these physical characteristics won't change over time, they are the stage. The actors on that stage, the animals, are moving around. As I said earlier, on average, whole populations 11 miles per decade. So the places with diversity in the physical landscape will continue to be the stage for biological diversity into the future, even as the mix of actors on the stage changes. So we have no idea or little idea where the majority of the current estimated 43,000 species are in Vermont. We do know where physical landscape diversity is. And so we can plan for biological diversity into the future just by understanding of the physical landscape. Okay, so all of these things together are what creates the resilient landscape. And again, it's the whole network that's important, not just the component parts. When we talk about conservation of this resilient network, we're referring to tools on the spectrum from land management to land use planning to regulatory options. But if we're going to find efficiency in our conservation work, we need to conserve at the coarsest scale possible. Let me explain. We have an estimated 24 to 43,000 species in Vermont. If we try and go one by one and wait too long and have a recovery plan for each of those species, it's inefficient and it's doomed to fail. It's much more efficient to think about conservation on the scale of landscapes and forest blocks and ensure that the right mix of physical landscapes are represented. When we do this right, we meet multiple goals. This resilient network is key to our climate future. It's not just ecological values that benefit, it's also recreational values, the working landscape, ideas that make economic sense, like clean water and rural care. The Department of Environmental Conservation has been working on statewide river corridor mapping. So let me explain this concept. River corridors encompass an area around and adjacent to a river where fluvial erosion, channel evolution, and down valley meander mitigation are most likely to occur. What I'm talking about here are physical processes. right? The river corridor widths are calculated to represent the narrowest band of valley bottom and riparian land that are necessary to accommodate the least erosive channel and floodplain geometry. Okay, so I'm talking about physical characteristics where we can reduce erosion and inundation. The State Rivers Program uses its Stream Geomorphic Assessment Program to provide baseline data on the physical health of Vermont's river systems. This Stream Geomorphic Assessment data is used by the state's team of river scientists in river corridor mapping, in planning, protection, restoration, and regulatory activities. The Rivers crew has done an amazing job of bringing this complex topic to road crews, decision makers, and the public. Again, it's really created culture change since Hurricane Irene, and the understanding of these issues is critical to climate resilience. Let me explain why this matters. So I just want to show you the story of two different communities in Hurricane Irene with respect to this resilient landscape. Now, Otter Creek flows north, and at right here is the hydrograph of the amount of water that Rutland and Middlebury saw over the course of Hurricane Irene and in the days that followed. So look at what different experiences those two communities had. Rutland saw a wall of water. There was literally a loss of human life because of this massive wall of water that came at Rutland all at once. Middlebury, by comparison, saw a much different gradual increase in flow in Otter Creek. So why was Middlebury so different? Because in between Rutland and Middlebury, the Otter Creek has access to a variety of wetlands and floodplains. So these wetlands build resilience into these aquatic systems and benefit all sorts of different values. They also sequester carbon. So floodplain work is critically important. Again, it's the rivers that are knitting this all together. And floodplain work is a good example of meeting multiple goals in critical floodplains. Let me just give an example from the Wolcott floodplain restoration. At right, we see as part of the governor's scan tour some of the members of this commission and folks from Agency of Transportation, Agency of Natural Resources, the regional planning commissions, the Nature Conservancy, who did a site tour of this Wolcott floodplain shelf, floodplain restoration and wildlife shelf. We're building a wildlife shelf under Route 15 to allow for animal movement. We're restoring this whole wetland. We've allowed for sheet flow across this wetland, and we're replanting it all with floodplain species. So this is just one example of meeting multiple goals, but our floodplain work does that. It meets multiple goals. It's incredibly important. Our work on this front goes far beyond the few examples that I've listed at left. It's really baked into every project that we're working on. And so again, we're working in partnership to meet multiple goals at the same time. Now, wetlands contain a disproportionate amount of the Earth's total soil carbon, holding between 20 and 30% of soil carbon, despite only occupying about 5 to 8% of the land surface. We have lots of programs in Vermont that are working on wetland conservation and restoration. Agencies focused on wetland restoration include the NRCS, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the federal level, DEC and Fish and Wildlife Department at the state level, and then nonprofits like Ducks Unlimited and Vermont Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy. The Fish and Wildlife Department has refocused its statewide land acquisition to focus on lands that have a wetland restoration component. We have $4.65 million available, which allows us to make strategic investments in wildlife management areas in the Champlain Basin. The NRCS has conserved 4,902 acres across 67 projects statewide through conservation easements, specifically to implement hydrologic restoration projects. Vermont's In Lieu Fee program is implemented through Ducks Unlimited, and it helps states to meet its no net loss policy for wetlands by restoring wetlands to offset wetland loss. The pictures I'm showing here are from the former Fitzgerald Farm along the Winooski River in Colchester, now owned and managed by the department as part of the Intervale Wildlife Management Area. All 143 acres are going to be restored as wetland habitat, and the infrastructure associated with the farm will be removed. Now, I said earlier that we need to conserve at the coarsest scale possible. You remember that? That's an incredibly important piece here. The Forest Legacy Program is an excellent example of landscape scale conservation. It's a partnership between the federal government, the state, run by Forest Parks and Rec, nonprofits, and landowners. It's really the most effective funding source to conserve large-scale forest lands in Vermont. We have up to $20 million a year to conserve working forests, both through conservation easements and fee acquisition. So far, this has conserved more than 75,000 acres. Of that, 10,000 acres in fee ownership and about 65,000 acres in easements. We've met an additional 30,000 acres in match. So we need to scale up programs like this to meet the need. Now, land protection alone isn't going to do it, but it's a huge piece of the overall resilient landscape. Currently, the state owns and manages more than 350,000 acres. That's about 8% of Vermont's land area. The feds own about another 8%. Of all the private land in Vermont, the Vermont Land Trust alone holds easements on about 10% of that area. And in total, Vermont is about 83% privately owned. So there's a lot of work to do here, and some great work is happening. We have effective programs that need to be scaled up to meet the need. So far, 34% of Vermont's conservation design highest priority area is already permanently conserved. 43% of that highest priority area is already in the use value appraisal program, the current use program. We didn't get there through just the efforts of state government. There's a huge array of NGOs, conservation partners that make this happen. And the Vermont Conservation Design helps coordinate that conservation action. So different partners are working on different angles of this overall network, but together it's building this ecologically functional landscape. The Vermont Land Trust, just one example here, the Deer Lake work that they're doing in Elmore is tens of thousands of acres over multiple projects. The Trust for Public Land is working on the Hunger Mountain headwaters. That's just under 2,000 acres. The Nature Conservancy has Glebe Mountain. We get assistance from the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, and many local land trusts are engaged here. So the VHCB hasn't been fully funded to its statutory requirements since the 80s. So we have programs that work that can be scaled up. We also have effective partnerships and coordination. So 30 years ago, if you wanted to make change, you'd start an organization. Today, if you want to make change, you coordinate as part of a network. So coordination doesn't sound interesting enough for funders to support these days. I guess it doesn't sound good, but that's exactly what's needed to support the network. It's exactly where additional resources are needed. We need a multi-pronged approach, and we have to coordinate to do that, and we need funding to coordinate to do that. We have effective public-private partnerships at the international scale. Here's one example that Vermont has been engaged in. The Staying Connected initiative is focused on habitat connectivity. Again, this full network of dark green. And it's effectively coordinating a multi-pronged conservation approach. That group and State of Vermont is a founding partner, has engaged in conservation science, like Vermont Conservation Design, land protection, like some of the slides I just showed you, land use planning, road barrier mitigation, I'll get to that in a few slides, and outreach and education. So we have these multi-pronged approaches that allow each of the partners to work on their specialty but are coordinated to meet a much larger goal. So funding for coordination of multi-pronged conservation approach is critical. Government alone can't do it. And our institutions are necessary. These coordination institutions are necessary to build resilience. Another example of this sort of coordination across the region, the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers, Governor signed a resolution 40-3 on ecological connectivity. Vermont and Quebec have been the co-chairs of that working group for the last 4 years. We are leading on these partnerships with multi-pronged conservation approaches. Now, Vermont Emergency Management has important grant programs for those that are affected by climate-related events. The Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund provides state funding to match federal public assistance after a federally declared disaster. The Hazard Mitigation Grant and Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program are the proactive funding to reduce future risk. The Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant, it's a new FEMA pre-disaster hazard mitigation program that replaces the existing pre-disaster mitigation program. So as a society, we're going to be facing increasing costs in programs like this as the number of disasters across the country increases. Investing in resilience beforehand and that resilient network is going to do a lot to lessen these costs. Another piece here is the regulatory work. Recent proposed amendments to Act 250 would have required considerations to climate change adaptation and would have tied those considerations to the needs and interests of local communities. Perhaps this is something that we can think about. Act 250 is important in this discussion in that it highlights how Vermont, even 50 years ago, was thinking broadly about how growth and development affect the health and integrity of the state. I mentioned Act 171, the Forest Integrity Bill, and the land use planning requirement that came on board January 1st of 2018, requiring towns to plan for forest blocks and connectors. It requires them to plan, but not to regulate. Additional examples, the implementation of the Shoreline Protection Permitting Program, the general permit related to stormwater for municipal roads, the Vermont Stormwater Management Manual, and the operational permitting associated with that. So we have some regulatory programs in place that are improving this resilient network. Lastly, I want to address the built infrastructure. We have something like 400,000 culverts in Vermont, and these are critically important parts of the resilient landscape where it all comes together, where human movement, animal movement, water and ice movement, we need to keep all of that flowing. When it doesn't flow, it really brings us to a halt. So transportation infrastructure is key to the economy for moving people and goods. It's no less important than facilitating ice flows and floodwaters and animal movement. And remember that resilience is the capacity of individuals, communities, and natural built systems to withstand and recover from climatic events. So when our infrastructure is undersized, as it was for Irene, it makes flood damage worse because we increase the speed of the water and then we give it more erosive force. We do have an excellent collaborative system in place where when the Agency of Transportation is beginning a new project, we do resource identification before any plans are drawn up. Agency of Transportation works directly with the Rivers Program and other parts of A&R to review every structure for sizing for river process, as well as aquatic organism passage and wildlife passage. The new structures we're building meet multiple goals and are appropriately sized. The problem facing us with climate change isn't our systems or how we coordinate on this topic. We're actually a regional leader in how well our Agency of Transportation and Agency of Natural Resources work together. The problem is at the scale at which we need to replace our infrastructure. It's funding. We need to put this system something like, I don't know, 30 years ahead of where we are now with respect to replacing this undersized infrastructure. In Hurricane Irene, the interstate system that was built for the 100-year flood, it performed quite well and was largely kept open. That number, by the way, just that number, 100-year flood, it actually refers to the percent likelihood of a storm of that size happening in any particular year. And so it's expressed as 1 over 100, but we're actually getting our 100-year flood more like every 10 years. In Irene, the municipal roads, and particularly bridges and culverts, were hit quite hard. Those are built for the 25-year storm. And the undersized infrastructure caused a huge portion of the damage. Again, I'm not just talking about inundation, water coming up. I'm talking about erosion, the speed of the water. So an undersized culvert increases the speed and then increases the damage. The standards for transportation infrastructure were changed in 2015. And the Agency of Transportation updated the hydraulics manual at that time, and that changes the sizing of our transportation projects. Since that time, VTrans has completed 34 projects to these new specifications, and there have been about 500 town and district projects. What you see on screen is an example from Hyde Park, and it shows a regular replacement. This was nothing special. No one went to bat for this in particular. This was just a regular change based on the hydraulics manual. And you can see how fundamentally different these sorts of changes look. So when we review a particular project, we often talk about the environmental impacts of that particular development. But if you take a step back, please understand that there's incredible environmental benefits to replacing old infrastructure across our entire road system. Okay, another piece here. The towns are increasingly adopting Orange Book standards. So so when disaster happens, if there's a FEMA emergency declared and the towns seek funding to replace blown out culvert, that structure can be rebuilt to the new higher standard if they adopted that Orange Book. As you can recall, that replace in kind versus replace the standard was a huge issue in our Hurricane Irene response. So again, this is a real success story. This is great work. What we're doing now is quite excellent. But we need to do is apply these changes on a scale we've never seen before. We have a variety of tools for assessing risk. The Vermont State Highway Flood Vulnerability and Risk Map, the Transportation Resilience and Planning Tool. There are some great examples. Currently, the Transportation Resistance Planning Tool that I'm showing on screen, it covers about 20% of the Vermont. That's about 9 watersheds. By next summer, the entire state will be included. That was a total of investment of about $1 million, with $233,000 of it coming from FEMA. So this is an example of, it's not that hard to figure out where our resilient infrastructure, where our at-risk infrastructure is. We now need to do something about it. So it's not a lack of good planning. We've got an excellent hazard mitigation plan, regional land use plans, energy plans, basin plans. It's a lack of coordination across planning. And it's not a lack of a good system for reviewing culverts. We have a great system in place for appropriately sizing our transportation infrastructure. It's the lack of funding to do this comprehensively across our system. So perhaps the easiest way to sum up all the things that I've been talking about in the last 40 minutes are that we have some really innovative systems and programs in place. The problem really is the way people are thinking. Decision makers need to come to terms with the massive scale of the threat that's facing us and vastly increase the support for many of the existing programs and institutions we've got in place. And yes, we'll also need to look for creating new programs and strategies. But everyone keeps looking around for new tools, as if we're going to find a particularly great deal somewhere, as if we could stop climate change for just $20 a day. I don't think that's reasonable. really what we need to do is profoundly scale up our implementation. Thank you all so much for sticking with me. We do have some time for questions.
Great, thank you, Jens. And that was a whirlwind tour of a lot of work by a lot of organizations, especially a whole bunch of departments in state government. And I would just ask that those members from those departments turn their cameras on for questions, if there's questions directed to your agencies, and that includes Vermont Emergency Management, other parts of the Agency of Natural Resources beyond Fish and Wildlife, VTrans, Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and the Agency of Ag, all have been key players in this, and it was our honor to get to present some of their work today. So thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Secretary Young.
Thank you, Commissioner. That was really a fantastic presentation, and that's really comprehensive and a lot to think about. We have a few minutes remaining for questions. I know that I think Chris Campany has had his hand raised for a while. Chris?
Hey, excellent presentation, Jens. I won't go on too long. Just a couple of things. One thing that, you know, planning in Vermont is incredibly diffuse. And it's incredibly diffuse in New England generally, it's especially diffuse in Vermont. And that's going to present a particular challenge. And one thing I just want to know about planning in Vermont is that for towns, whether or not they choose to have a town plan is their option. And whether or not they want to have a town plan reviewed by a regional planning commission is their option. So in other words, towns can develop and adopt a plan or not based on, you know, their druthers. Whether or not they want to have that plan reviewed by regional planning commissions is also up to them. A regional review, with the exception of Act 174 enhanced energy planning elements for town plans, review of a town plan by regional commissions has no bearing on their standing in Act 250 whatsoever. It really has to do with the carrot and sticks, really have to do with whether or not they can qualify for certain programs like designated town village center, designated downtown, and other programs like that, and whether or not they can apply for certain grants. I just think it's important to know this because oftentimes I feel like the town planning structure in Vermont is kind of like Charlie Brown's Christmas tree. We keep passing planning requirements, you know, another ornament on that humble little tree that ultimately causes it to topple over. As Jens correctly notes, you know, this is a group of volunteers typically. There is no training requirement. There's no, you know, I used to live and work in New York. You know, there are certain requirements if you're going to be a planning board member that you had to meet for ongoing education. I'm not saying that that's what should happen in Vermont, but, you know, it's just we're relying a lot on volunteers to do a lot of very heavy, serious work. And then when we get to implementation, we don't really have the resources to do that. And one other bit of infrastructure that Jens mentioned briefly, but I just wanted to point out again, I pointed out in other meetings of this group, is that in the absence of infrastructure to actually support compact settlement cannot happen. And I know Julian Moore has been vocal about this too. But if you look at the comprehensive energy plan, if you look at the state transportation plans, regional plans, town plans, everything ultimately hinges in order to stem rural sprawl on compact settlement. And for most of our villages, you can't even add a single dwelling unit in the absence of that. So this gets back to the schedule of this group, you know, what this council is expected to achieve. We've got a lot of structural issues in terms of planning and implementation that tie in directly to the work of this council, and we have to have that kind of on the forefront of our minds, not only about what needs to change, but the structure that we're working with. And I'll hush up now.
Melissa, I'll turn it over to you to call on those who've had their hand raised.
Absolutely, thank you. Member Dupany-Jouard, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Jens, wonderful presentation. Great to see you again. Thank you for sort of very nicely elucidating what I think a lot of our challenges, which is to turn everything on its head. And I think you mentioned that several times throughout the presentation that we need a different way of thinking about how we move forward. And that sort of is a nice tie-in with what Susanna presented earlier with thinking about it from a different perspective, again, but more people perspective. And so I think really taking both of your presentations to heart, critically important. Two questions for you. The first one is, all of those places that you pulled the information from, is there a single portal where somebody who is starting from scratch, who would love to come up to speed on all of the things that state agencies are doing across the board, is there a single portal where you can come in and have all of this information together? So that was question number one. And question number two is, you kept referring to the fact that there are resources that are missing to help move some of these conversations forward. And so thinking back to the program that you came through at UVM and maybe tying in a lot of higher education resources and programs and sort of departments, can we sort of use some of the existing talent across the state that might be in higher ed to help bring some of this together? So if you could respond to those two, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Regarding the second question first. So yes, I do think there's a huge capacity in Vermont with our academic institutions and partnerships, but there's a really profound need to make sure that those great ideas are tested in actual on-the-ground implementation. So things that are just born in academia or just born in state government are going to be less likely to do well than those efforts that effectively bring those together. So you mentioned the program at UVM that I went through, the Field Naturalist program, and that's a great example of interdisciplinary field science and an ability to be a jack of all trades, master of none. I think more of those sorts of skills are needed to look at the resilient landscape, to think about how all of those different silos add together to make the resilient landscape. So yes, I do think we have that. We have resources at UVM and other colleges and universities across Vermont, but we really need to make sure that the academics, the researchers, and the implementers are working hand in hand. Regarding your first question of, is there a single portal? I don't know of one, and I will leave that to Secretary Moore or Commissioner Porter to talk about. I just have a list of an informal list of programs we were able to put together in preparation for this.
Thanks, Jens.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I can maybe weigh in here just for a moment to say that is one of the tasks contained in the Global Warming Solutions Act is to complete this inventory. And so the work that the cross-agency staff teams have done in assembling these presentations will be foundational. But to my knowledge, Leslie, and that doesn't exist currently, and that's part of why this was such an important place to start and make sure that we had that comprehensive accounting of what's already being done and bring that information to the council.
Thanks, Julie.
Melissa, are there any other council members with their hands raised or no. Speak up now if you don't have the hand raising function?
No more council members have their hands raised.
Okay. I know, Mr. Bayer, you have your hand raised, and we will have a public comment period at the end of the meeting. So please hold your comments till then. Well, thank you again. That was really a very comprehensive, very interesting presentation, Hans and Louis. We appreciate the work that went into that. It's the point in our agenda. We're about 10 minutes over, but that's okay. There's always some wiggle room built in at the end around organizational updates. So I would propose that we take our break now. It's about 10:45, 10:43, and reconvene at about, well, let's say 10:55. We can, if there's no objections to that, if there are, raise your hands or holler, shout out now. Otherwise, we will we'll stop recording at this point in time. Feel free to stay on, chat amongst yourselves about anything other than the business of the board. Be great, or take a stretch, get some water, and we will see you back in about 12 minutes. Thank you.